Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you've had a good lunch. Great to see you. I'm particularly happy about that announcement. I just took a huge promotion from Chief Executive of Optum Genomics to Chief Executive of Optum. So thank you very much indeed. We are here to talk about some of the most exciting and some of the most challenging advances in healthcare. I think, this morning was just stunning in terms of the technology, the speed, the velocity of what is happening in this space is off the charts. And everybody is here because you're excited about it. I think, we all see a future where your risk of adverse drug events is mitigated through pharmacogenetic tools, where polygenic risk scoring can increase the accuracy and earliness of our risk stratification of patients on a population basis, where monogenic disease can be captured early to prevent diagnostic odysseys, which can be so awful and traumatic for families. So I think we see this huge opportunity in front of us. We also see massive challenges in integrating this technology into healthcare. And I really, for this session, what I want to do with the panel is have a frank conversation rather than one that is sugar-coated about what some of those challenges look like. We are going to go into some of the real beacons and internationally as well as domestically in the US and the UK. But I also want to talk about what are the blockers, what are the enablers, what do those look like, and I've told these guys I kind of don't really want to have a glib conversation about what each of those blockers or enablers are. I want to try and tease out what we can do about it. And if it does get glib and we all end up holding hands and singing Kumbaya, I will roll a few hand grenades across the floor. So Peter, I'd love to kind of go into what you're doing in North Shore. I think there's, what you're doing is a really exciting example of how pushing the boundaries forwards. So tell us what you're up to.
Absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and with this esteemed panel. We heard how rickety our health systems are. We treat disease, but we've gone away from that wellness. How do we ensure patients live the healthiest lives possible? As a community health system at heart, that's really our core mission. And what we've been doing over the past 5 to 6 years is really how do we turn that paradigm and start to get ahead of risk and put it in a personalized plan. We've started to leverage clinical decision support in Epic so that before every annual history and physical, we have a structured branching logic family history tool that helps identify patients who might be at higher risk, meet guidelines for hereditary cancer testing. But it also offers a path to more population genomics where people can get hereditary cancer conditions tested for, some of the more prominent cardiovascular conditions like familial hypercholesterolemia, and of course pharmacogenomics. In a structured way where the PCP, it's almost like an easy button where the correct order is teed up, and then the results come back discreetly so that we can get the right information at the right time for patients regardless of where they are in our health system. To date, we have close to 30,000 patients who have done this clinically in our system. While that sounds like a great number, I'm certainly proud of it because it's been a lot of work. When you think about where we are in our health system, where we've had some acquisitions, where now we're caring for about 1 million lives, we still have a lot of work to do. And I think that's an important, celebrate the wins, but there's still a lot more to do at this point.
That's great, thank you. And Teresa, let's talk a little bit about the Tapestry program. Love to hear.
I will. Before I do that, I'd like to just explain so you aren't confused that what they didn't mention, in addition to my current role at Helix, which is only about 3 weeks old, my last 25 years have been at Mayo Clinic, and so I'll be focusing on a lot of the efforts that we've done there. The Tapestry program is one of our population scale programs that was set out right before COVID hit to enroll 100,000 patients into population scale sequencing. That has been very exciting. We are currently about halfway through that enrollment with 55,000 patients. But as you say, I'm very proud of that. It took over 800,000 invitations to get that many people to sign up. I can explain a little bit more in detail later about our methodologies for doing that, things we're going to try differently. But I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, we'll definitely come back to some of that. Rory, tell us a bit about what you've been doing at the Biobank, and indeed how UK is looking at the population genomics programs.
Sure. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. UK Biobank is a cohort of 500,000 people who joined the study in Britain. They were aged 40 to 69 back in 2006, 2010. We've now sequenced all 500,000, both exome and whole genome sequencing, genotyping. We've now done proteomics on about 60,000 of them, and we're currently imaging with magnetic resonance, brain, heart, and body, 100,000. And last week, we announced that we'll be bringing back 60,000 of those 100,000 and repeat imaging them. And they're all linked in to the health records within the National Health Service. I think the important thing is that all of these data are made available to researchers around the world to try to understand the determinants of many different diseases. Genetic determinants, lifestyle, environment, and also by having proteomics, being able to look at what the links are between genetic variants that are associated with disease and the disease itself. In the way we think about the genetic variants that cause familial hypercholesterolemia, the cholesterol level, and the high risk of heart disease. There are 30,000 researchers around the world using the data, and 10,000 of those researchers are in the US. We're starting to see more and more findings coming out of those data. I think particularly the most interesting from my perspective is the idea of polygenic risk scores that can identify people who are at high risk of many different diseases where one could then intervene at an early age and prevent them from getting those diseases.
Could you just say a little bit more about how the Biobank has enabled the kind of research on the PRS space? Because it really is at the very vanguard.
Well, before the UK Biobank genetic data became available, people often argued that the idea that genetic variants of small effect associated with disease couldn't be useful for predicting disease. Once the data were actually there, in fact, it was a PhD student working at Harvard under Setka Thiersen who did the first analysis that showed that that wasn't true. The great thing about data is it proves you're wrong every time. What they showed was that you could find about 3 to 5% of the population based on a polygenic risk score, where you combine variants of small effect that were at risk of heart disease equivalent to someone with familial hypercholesterolemia, where you're talking about 1/10 of that rate. And then people have extended that. They found 3 to 5% that have a risk equivalent to BRCA1, BRCA2, which is again maybe around, depending on the population, 1/10 of that. And so on and so forth. And Peter Donnelly in the UK has shown that you can take about 16 conditions and a quarter of the population will be in the top 3 to 5% for one or more of those conditions. So one can see how it could be really useful for identifying people in their 20s or 30s that are at high risk of heart disease, where you might consider offering them early intervention with statins or PCSK9 inhibitors. Similarly with screening, perhaps one would screen earlier for breast cancer or prostate cancer or colorectal cancer, or screen in a different way in those people who are at higher risk. And of course there are people at the other extreme who are at lower risk, where you might be less likely to intervene. So I can see kind of precision population health emerging from that.
It's fantastic, thank you. And Stuart, I want to bring you in at this point. I think we've heard a lot throughout the last couple of days around the role of the physician in the healthcare system. Stuart's a passionate educator of the next generation, both in the medical sector and as a coach of kids' sports teams. And I think it's easy to say, wouldn't it be good if doctors just did, or wouldn't it be good if we could just take X out of the loop, or whatever the statement is. But this is a really tough challenge to kind of to wrangle with. So tell us a bit more.
All right. Well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. So I've listened in the last 2 days. I listened to my panelists, large numbers, tremendous successes. My journey, I'm a surgical and molecular pathologist. So this all makes very nice sense to me. And I can look back at the beginning of my career, and the advances have been astronomical. My task now is to train the next generation of physicians in a wealth in medicine that's advancing, but a critical one is in the field of genomics and how they are going to be consumed by it and therefore hopefully advantage it. And that goes then to the training of residents. So I've heard a few times already this week about how we need to train physicians to be, I'll use the word scholars with genomics. And I'll just give you, I think you mentioned obstacles at the beginning of this. I'll just share some obstacles, but then that's not the reason to quit. So 60 brand new students show up to my medical school in July. They might have heard the word genomics, they might not have, but they don't know anything about any of this. Obstacles for these young people are, I'll give you a couple big ones. So it's now stated that medical knowledge doubles every 70 days. Medical knowledge, not genomics knowledge. So you can imagine, in their first year of medical school, they've watched 5 doublings of medical knowledge. And of course, they can't stay up on that. The other thing is, which is very pragmatic for them, and we have to teach them everything else, not just genomics. The other pragmatic part is, and this is the thing you have to realize when you train young people, where's their value in it? And they don't see their value 15 years from now. They see their value in the next exam they have to pass to be licensed. And genomics has not hit that exam. So when we teach them genomics, they understand they should know it, but they're kind of pushing back because they're not, and they need to pass that exam. So I want you to appreciate, the same happens with residents. They're very busy, and they know they should know a lot of things about a lot of things. So long-winded way to say, brand new medical school, got a chance to build a new curriculum. It's not the 1910 Flexnerian curriculum that is how US medical schools are grounded. And one of the things our students get exposed to at a much greater depth, but they're not experts, is in fact genomics. And so we give them ways in which it becomes practical to them, to make it stick.
That's super helpful, thank you. And I mean, let's stick around on this for a little bit longer, because there is, I think it's fair to say, an international epidemic of burnout among doctors and clinicians broadly. And part of that is the sheer volume of data that's flying at them. And you've just alluded to how that, the rate of increase of kind of knowledge in this space. So then you throw at doctors a whole bunch of data that is difficult, uncertain, difficult to know what to do with, isn't necessarily in practice guidelines, doesn't have regulatory direction, etc. Can we expect them to, for something to become standard of care before it is in fact standard of care?
Well, I would say, I think we can have that expectation and then keep it real. I think the problem is if we don't, we've admitted defeat. And we know this is going to be critical to the future of healthcare. So I want to titer them, get them a little excited, a little inquisitive, with examples that are real. They may have actually seen them in their life. Right. Because my feeling is 10 years from now, let's say everybody's sequenced and it's in your EHR, I don't want them threatened by that. I want them at least to say, there are things in here that are going to help me take care of you, your health, predict, as opposed to what physicians will do very quickly is they will just shut down and be intimidated and then not use it. And then when you don't use it, then it's of no value.
Yeah, thank you. We should talk a bit
about to speak to that more. I don't think the answer is necessarily to pile on more data. There are certain things that we can do much better than what we're doing right now. Take the CDC Tier 1 conditions. If every health system could say those had been reasonably assessed in every organization in the US, that would be a huge win. That would change lives. That is currently not done. Our system, that I like to think we're innovative. We have over 100,000 patients who have taken our family structured questionnaire this fiscal year. About 20% of them are flagged positive and meet NCCN criteria, but only a fraction of them have moved on to genetic testing. We're missing an opportunity there, and we have to work on closing that loop. And part of that is getting that right information at the right time, so we don't need genomic experts as PCPs, but we need them to be comfortable with the process, and we have the next step for them. They need to know what that clear next step is for the patient, so when they get asked, they can say, this is what you need to do. Okay, let's move on, because there's a zillion other things that I need to do to help you with your health.
Nick, as part of my role at Mayo Clinic, we worked with a number of different departments and specialty areas to try to meet them where they were at. And there's kind of the three pillars of pre-test, testing, and post-test. We don't need to give them a lot of information about the actual details, like you heard this morning, underneath the hood of the testing process. It's the who do you need to recognize that needs to be tested? What is the right test to order? And let's make that easy for them. So we started working with specialty departments to predefine when they see that patient, what is the test that you need to order, and then make the ordering process super easy. We tried to teach areas how to order their own genetic test. I don't know if many of you have tried to order send-out tests. That gets nuanced. I'm not saying it's complicated. People can learn it, but it takes time. So really giving them the easy path, the easy button to say, I recognize my patient, I want to order the test, it's one button, and they get to maintain themselves as the ordering provider in this situation, but we've got the team around it, we call it our genetic testing and counseling unit, that orders the tests for them. When results are back, we review it with them, so they are learning real time with their patient. That's really important to them. What they need to do with that, and we co-develop that plan of care. So that has worked well because we've met them where they're at, and as you pointed out, they're all over the board with their knowledge of genetics to begin with.
And that safety net is critical so that you raise the bar so there's a certain foundation that you know is going to happen in terms of care. Yes, you'd like to be at a higher level, but as we heard yesterday, better is always a good next step. And we have to be prepared that we can't wait for the perfect solution or we're not going to get anywhere. We have to keep iterating and chipping away at this. And I think that's where I've seen with my colleagues who have been successful, we take a different approach, but we keep chipping away and fail fast, but recognize it. And that takes knowing where your data is and how do you structure that data in your system.
Super helpful, thank you. Therese, let's go back to the patients in the Tapestry study and the point that you were making about the enrollment rates.
Right.
This to me is really fascinating. I mean, what are the different dimensions, trust or concern about privacy or security that are in play here? I mean, the Mayo Clinic has to be one of the beacons of trust, I would expect, from a patient perspective. So
right.
Just help us unpick that a bit.
Right. I will also say that I'm a genetic counselor by training, so I've met with a lot of patients, and the Tapestry program is the first that we've implemented that really provides an invitation to have genetic testing that will be part of their clinical record, very similar to yours, Peter. We do the CDC Tier 1. That is a clinical test that's returned to them. There's also a research component whereby we retain their genetic data for ongoing research. So it's twofold. But they receive the invitation. We have a highly scalable automated system up front, but what is taken out of that is the personalization, in that they receive an email with an invitation, and as you said, we only have about an 8 to 10% uptake. I think most people just don't even look at it. Either they see the email, they're too busy, they don't even want to engage in it. We have asked if they would kindly let us know why they don't want to participate, and the top reasons are they're uninterested, and they are worried about their results in their medical record and what that is going to do to potential insurability in the future.
They're not worried that genetics is destiny. They're worried about how that information will be used.
Right, right. So I think I think the general population really, I mean, I was thinking about it for myself. If different context, right? I know about genetics. I'm all about it. Let's do it. But if my bank unsolicitedly said to me, hey, we're running a study on the financial impact of X, Y, or Z. The only thing you have to do is give us all your financial information. And oh, by the way, if we find something in there, it might be detrimental to your retirement. I don't know that I'd immediately jump at that, right? So I think there are some just barriers of the unknown, the fear of the unknown, the maybe lack of knowledge of the benefit this could do, that is overshadowed by this fear that unfortunately is perpetuated in weird ways that genetics is somehow going to be a problem for them in the future, and things that we can't do something about, when at least for the CDC Tier 1 conditions, we absolutely can do something about it. So I think we have a lot of education, more broad education to do with our patients to really help them understand. And we've provided lots of videos and things, but I don't even know that many of them even get to that point. It's just like, no, it's really not all that important. So I don't think they understand the importance of genetics to their healthcare and then the downstream impact to their family until it hits.
Yeah. And I think that trust also, we have to show patients how this is being used to help their care. And I point thumbs at this problem. We anchor a lot on the positive test, but every day in our system, we have a tremendous amount of clinical decision support running for pharmacogenomics that most of the time isn't going to necessitate a patient or a physician having to do something different with their medication. But we took that information into account when that prescription was right, and that is key. We're using all the data. Sometimes it'll be a genomics drive, sometimes it'll be something else in the HR, sometimes it's going to be a combination. But how do we show that to a patient so that they know we're using all the available data to make the best decision for their care? And that's something I think we need to work on in terms of as a system to try to convey why should we be privileged to be able to use their data, and they should be willing to share it with us.
And I would just add, I agree with you. I think, again, I now train the next generation of physicians. If they're either threatened or apathetic to this, they become another obstacle for you. In fact, they might ask the patient might ask their PCP, should I participate in this? And if the answer is, I don't, why would you? I don't. So that is a huge task, but it's one, the way we're going to expedite this and move it forward is to have the healthcare workforce well-versed in this, or better versed.
So we've got some really strong themes coming through, and we've been talking about some great example cases. A few instances with excited heroes in the country aren't going to create a nationwide spread, adoption at scale and pace, right? So I'm going to be the heretic at the altar now. So I'm actually really interested in what Eric Topol said briefly yesterday, which is a lack of compelling data, a lack of compelling evidence for clinical use, as one of the key potential barriers here from the perspective of taking a technology and integrating it into mainstream healthcare. Stuart, Rory is an epidemiologist, really interested in kind of how you think about how we need to address that challenge.
Well, I would say I obviously I think we all agree with Dr. Topol in regards to prove it. And a lot of what we're hearing in the last day and a half is kind of proving it. So we're hearing it over and over again. But I agree. I do not want to try to train individuals with, and we know some things will be reversed, that are not well studied right now. I mean, my students have to do a 4-year research project and publish a thesis. The entire intent of that is to teach them how to do investigative studies and put it to the test of today's mechanism to validate it. Right. So I agree. Yeah.
We need to prove it, but we need to change somewhat how we prove it. Otherwise, we're going to miss a lot of potential here in terms of the promise of personalized medicine. So how do we innovate, just like we've done with sequencing? How do we innovate proving it? And I really believe that getting this data structured and building on this concept of a learning health system so we can rapidly deploy different algorithms quickly and learn on it and iterate so that we can get that data much faster. But the problem is we've been too siloed with a lot of our data. We still have PDFs. If we're lucky, we have PDFs of lab reports. So that is one thing that I think can be an accelerator, but we have to put as much resources.
Let me prod on that for a second. Mm-hmm. So in some of our conversations previously, we've talked about the risks of genetic exceptionalism. Mm-hmm. That you kind of because this is a belief space that we kind of somehow carve it out and treat it differently. But there are in healthcare, you work with first do no harm, mm-hmm. clinical validity, clinical utility as being core to what actually then gets used on patients. So Peter, I know you've kind of toiled with this a bit in terms of,
Yeah. So absolutely, Yes, there's complexities to genomic data. Do we understand everything about our genome? Absolutely not. But it's something that there are certain areas and guardrails where we can put in place for screening where we have good data. We know pathogenic variants across a number of hereditary cancer genes. We know if you give Plavix to someone who doesn't convert it to the active form, it's not going to work. So where do we build on some of these early wins and put in a more robust system to look at the downstream of those effects? And that takes measuring the different time points to care in an iterative way. What's fortunate now is there are a number of systems that have been on an EHR for a growing number of times, so you can also start to look retrospectively. Had we known this data in the past, what could we have predicted to start to get an earlier window into that clinical utility, which is what we're trying to prove. So while yes, it's not the traditional prospective, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled study, you're getting a good signal that, quite frankly, a number of prominent genomic-based tests were approved by the FDA on. So, there is a way to do this, but we have to get that data structure to do it.
Right. So, Rory, how does the biobank help us in this pursuit? And I know that we've talked about the difference between the individual versus population-based screening programs. So, talk us, I'd love to get your perspective on this.
So we heard from President Obama yesterday about the Precision Medicine Initiative, which led to the initiation of the All of Us cohort, which is going to recruit 1 million people across the US, about halfway there. And again, I think that's a really important project. The UK Biobank is great because it has 500,000 people, it has a lot of genetic data, and it has long-term follow-up already. But it's the UK population, and what's really good about the All of Us cohort is it extends the information we have about a much wider range of different kinds of people, increases the diversity. And I think that's critical, and we need some studies in other populations around the world that are interestingly different. And why do I say that? Because I think what we've found from UK Biobank, and it was the genetic data really came out in 2016 from UK Biobank, which I think helped to drive the decisions to set out the Precision Medicine Initiative, is that genetics is no longer a minority sport. The idea of polygenic risk scores that identify people at risk and can identify a large proportion of people who are at risk of different conditions moves us away from single gene disorders where you're essentially saying yes, no to disease, to a probabilistic approach that's relevant to a very wide proportion of the population. And I think it will require a different thinking about what does genetic data mean. It's much more like the data we had before in terms of risk. Cholesterol level increases your risk of heart disease. It doesn't mean you will necessarily get it. Blood pressure, smoking. And I think yes, people will have to understand more about genetics, but I think also we have the opportunity to build this into the systems. So for example, in the UK, in the NHS, they're piloting adding in polygenic risk score for coronary artery disease to the other non-genetic risk scores that are already used by primary physicians. So they put a lot of information into the system, the polygenic risk score is there, and it says you should be thinking about starting a statin. I think again with screening systems, at the moment, women aged 50 get invited for screening in Britain, all done centrally. One could build in the polygenic risk scores. So I can see genetic data being there as part of the determinants of what services are offered in terms of screening, in terms of preventive strategies, and a kind of shift away from the yes-no towards probabilistic, a shift away from this is something for a minority of doctors and a minority of patients to something that's relevant to all patients, all the public, and all their doctors.
Can I come back on a sort of two-pronged question? One, does that mean that you don't have to do a clinical validation study? And two, are we talking about integrated risk tools here, where your clinical data, your social determinants of health data, your genetic data, genetics is one input into that risk calculation?
I think the idea that you would expect doctors to remember what are the genetic variants that mean I should or shouldn't prescribe something, or what's the polygenic risk score that means I should start a statin or whatever, is a bit Luddite, really. I was trying to explain a slide rule to my colleagues, and they had to look it up. But we don't use slide rules anymore. We use computers. We have things that can be built into the system that help us to make the right decisions. They don't tell us to do it, but they are guides. And I think as more and more of the population have genetic data in their record, why would you not use it?
Prime example to that, in our system, in a lot of health systems, when you're in the inpatient, there are different clinical factors that can lead to a prolongation of the QT interval. Well, now we have patients with discrete data for some of the inherited conditions that can cause a risk there too. So we've altered our clinical decision support that when someone has a high clinical risk for prolongation of the QT and they have a germline variant, it's a different tier of alerting mechanism to alert. The physician or whoever gets that alert, they probably had no idea what that gene did or what it was, but it's up there in combination with the other clinical parameters to say this is a very high risk situation. That's what it boils down to. High risk QT, we need to make some adjustments. And that's getting the right amount of information at the right time for our care teams. What is
the attitude of your clinicians now? What's the sort of temperature?
Oh, they're all in, but no. In true reality, it's bimodal. We have our early adopters, and that was kind of a small bump.
And the early adopters are right into understanding that combination of risk factors and looking at the data. They're
believers that this is important information to have. Now they're looking to help us incorporate it. And we're not trying to turn primary care physicians into geneticists or genomicists, but give them the tools so that they can incorporate this information. We have a lot of physicians who, particularly at BRCA 1 and 2, are very comfortable counseling in that space. So we've tried to build a system that they can be as hands-on as they want communication, because we've done a number of studies. The biggest driver of any action is if their PCP told them to do something, regardless of what it is. So we don't want to impede that, but we also don't want to prevent someone from getting the right care in terms of getting their genetic risk assessment because their physician may not be comfortable with it, and our structure allows for us to take more ownership, kind of like a navigator system for when a lot of places for their mammography screening, when there's a positive mammography, usually a navigator system often will take over. PCP's in the loop, but they're not really actively managing, but they're there for the patient, if there's particular questions.
Well, I'll channel you a little bit, Nick. So to the long QT set up inside of an ICU, and it was the issue of sudden cardiac death from certain drugs. And two things happened. First of all, we talked about physician burnout, but there's also alert burnout. So these docs are constantly getting alerts, and they just, like we all would do, they just start ignoring them. So if all of a sudden a long QT alert pops up, they just blow through it. They don't even necessarily know they saw it. But even more, we get that. Very disappointing to me, and it was a physician who said it to me, said, why should we implement this? And I will just share, it was not going to cost them any money. We had it all set up in the system.
This by the way, is...
The flagging of long QT risk and a medication, that is one of the medications they probably should not get. And the answer was, unfortunately, what some of us would expect. It was, we don't make any money doing this. So that was the incentive to do this in a very contained environment. Wasn't to save a life, it was, we're not going to get reimbursed for this. So, and that's another thing I don't think we can just ignore. This is a business.
Well, and the reimbursement bit goes back to the evidence that the payers need to reimburse.
Right.
Teresa, what are your reflections on this?
Making it easy isn't easy, right? I think that there are expertise and teams that are necessary, but it does really require a focused effort and stakeholders from all sides, right? It's very easy to say, well, we've got polygenic risk and we've got the data and maybe someday it will be reimbursed, but to get that into the system, to make it work, there's medical record systems that don't talk to each other, that don't work well. I think there are a lot of barriers to that. And then I go back to the patient, right? We can do all these great things, but unless we bring our patients along with us, it's going to be hard to get their buy-in unless we're confident in what we're doing, and as you say, unless their primary care and the people that we're meeting with are doing it. A great example that we've come across in the Tapestry program, because we've identified patients who have a previously unknown risk, is it was in their medical record. And unfortunately, they may have gone to their PCP, but they went for a backache, not to tell them about their mother who died of ovarian cancer. And so we have to find ways that our physicians can have that information presented. I know Mayo Clinic's working very hard to get visuals and snapshots that really give a quick and easy, that don't make you comb through years and years of genetic data that maybe was done 5 years ago. Right? It's got to stay relevant, and I think that's another one of our challenges.
And I think to that point too, it can't be just a personalized medicine problem. This is, each health system has to kind of look at what's working, what's not working in the system. So screening in general, health maintenance, that's a challenge for any system. There's, benchmarks around that. So part of that is just your global effort in screening, but how do you start to intertwine the culture of, well, we can sub-risk stratify a little bit more by incorporating genomics, and that's kind of where our program has started to evolve to, where we were kind of siloed in our risk assessment. Now we've got that buy-in from critical stakeholders that, okay, when we launch a new screening initiative, we need to be thinking about how are we going to account for any kind of genomic risk as part of that. And then your system starts to align around, that's when real change starts to happen. Getting back to your question about the physician adoption, one thing that's been successful with our organization is we coined this term, and it's stuck for better or for worse, genomic ambassadors, where we identified some primary care physicians who had interest. They believe that they need to know how to incorporate this going forward. We've had about 25 primary care physicians and one APM. They commit for a year, and we've had 2 classes now where they have at least an hour commitment per month, where they do some extra learning. A large part of that was disease-centric, but we found what they really want is, like, I want to know what are the operational steps, how, and then it provided a good feedback for us. How do we make sure we're not getting in the way of them doing their jobs, because they do have stuff they need to get done? How do we make this more seamless? And that's been huge for getting more buy-in, because the other thing is now we also go task them with going to their different groups within the organization and sharing this knowledge. So it's not just me saying that this is important, it's peer-to-peer in their primary care team. Now, it's not the magic solution, but that, again, it's those incremental cultural changes that you need to keep you going in the right direction.
Well, I love this, and I'd like to just sort of carry on the theme of, basically, so much of change is about making the case for change more compelling than the case for staying the same. And in this instance, we're talking about actually being able to see meaningful benefits coming out of testing. So, I'm kind of really interested in the CDC Tier 1 program. What have you seen what have patients seen in terms of actual changes in outcomes of care or pathways? I remember when I, 10 years ago, did sorry, this is a kind of general theme of 23andMe bashing, sorry, did my 23andMe test, and the results came back, and I discovered that I was likely white Caucasian male from Europe, and I was groundbreaking discovery. So needless to say, I haven't spent a great deal of time on that one recently. But I'm interested in, like, what does this mean for the patient in terms of, like, it changing their life?
Right. Well, I learned that I was not an elite athlete, so imagine my surprise. For many patients, they're actually quite thankful, and I think especially in the context of the people who have elected to have this, they are seeking something. I've been involved in a handful of research projects that are similar in that they're almost disappointed if you don't find anything, right? Not finding anything is boring. So the positive side are those patients who are really excited, engaged, thankful, go all the way to have their family members tested. But we also see the other end of the spectrum, where either patients who really, really need the testing don't have it. And we have switched now. It's not just an elective, this is interesting information to know and you may want to know for the future. Your physician needs this information for the therapy decision or the surgical decision. So I think that's been a shift. But even in our Tapestry program, once we tell patients that we've identified this significant risk that we can do something about, there are many who don't reach back out to us. And that's what makes me lose sleep at night. Where did we fail? Where did we fail in helping them to understand the importance of it? But I would say by and large, those patients who are aware and electing to do this really do take action. As of the main stage yesterday, we're too early in our data to know because this takes long-term follow-up. As far as the outcomes of the patients we've just identified, some of them already knew of their genetic results, so we have a little bit of bias of people who've had genetic testing. Good to see that they're excited to want to have more. We have the patients who definitely stay engaged with us, but there are unfortunately many that they see something really flashy and cool, sign up, and then we don't hear from them again. So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
That's great, Rory. You are either winking at me or flirting with me.
Well, I think they're not mutually exclusive strategies, but I was thinking as you were talking about patients that. I'm also interested in the people who are not patients. And I think that's really what I was trying to get at when saying it's no longer a minority sport. The evidence we've now got about genetics and in patients and in their families and things that we can do has really changed a lot. But I think what has changed particularly is the relevance of genetics to the rest, the people who are not yet patients. And I think it's just not the case for, say, the National Health Service, but for many healthcare services. If we can work out how to prevent people from becoming patients, or at least becoming patients earlier than they might, then that's beneficial not just to them, but to their healthcare systems. So can we come up with much more cost-effective ways of preventing disease or of extending healthy life by using genetic information? As it becomes more and more widely available, can we build it into the systems that, as I suggested earlier, are used to screen for diseases in a targeted way, to screen for people who are at high risk in a targeted way, and then apply kind of precision population health so that we avoid people becoming patients earlier than they might. These are complementary strategies to the way genetics has largely been used in the past, and I think the two together could be revolutionary. And I think that's what we're going to see over the next 5-10 years. And the more data we have from more and more different populations, the more precise our probabilistic approaches to preventing disease will become.
I would just piggyback on what you just said about the underrepresented, your last comment. I know I'm stating the obvious, which I'm very good at doing. We struggle to bring the underrepresented. We just watched it with the COVID vaccine and all the lack of trust and the lack of willingness to participate. So when I talk about educating physicians, the other issue is patients who either we're not even getting into because of the healthcare system, or they're not interested when we do get into the health, and they are brought in. Big problem, as we all know.
And that's the beauty of the All of Us cohort, because more than half the participants in that cohort are actually from underrepresented populations and genetic studies. So I think you talking to Josh Denny yesterday, he's saying that they're getting very good buy-in in that respect. And I think that the evidence that will emerge from that study will be incredibly important. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's critical. You look at our system-wide mammography rate and it looks really good, but you go in and there's different pockets in our footprint where it's certainly not where we'd want it to be. Now we have this subset of populations that are higher risk that we know that aren't following up their mammograms, and they have a high family risk just on our family history tool. And then some of those have gone on to do genetic testing. And so we all have finite resources. If you're going to try to really impact go after, certainly the highest risk patients and make sure they're at least getting the basic screening as the first step. Again, this incremental improvement, okay, maybe they didn't get the MRI, which would be ideal in conjunction with the mammogram, but at least let's get them the mammogram at an earlier age. I mean, we have to start somewhere and not, fail because we don't have the perfect solution.
You've done a wonderful job of running down the clock, Peter. Thank you so much. We are out of time. I was going to run a quick fire, like the one priority thing that you would like to see changing in the system. So I'm going to I'm not an Obama length response in the quick fire. Where would you target efforts, Teresa?
Systems and infrastructure to make it work.
Rory?
Yeah, reducing fear of genetic data and just seeing it as being like all other kinds of data in terms of helping you to practice better and prevent disease.
Peter?
Closing care gaps after identifying risk.
Stuart?
And I teach the next generation, so the pragmatism, I would kind of echo Teresa. I want things that are digestible for both patients and young learners so they can actually embrace this instead of being intimidated and shy away from it.
Awesome. Thank you all for your time. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to the panelists.